This is the first partner forum that JP Morgan Chase is participating in as a formal member, and thank you. We're very, very excited about that. I thought it was really important that, you know, we ease into this for our inaugural contribution with a very humble and sort of modest topic. And so today we're going to talk about the geopolitics of AI, like the whole world. We're going to do it in the next 9 minutes or so. But before that, I do want to provide a little bit of context so you know why you're listening about the geopolitics of AI from the guy from JP Morgan Chase. The business at JP Morgan Chase it's expansive, and it is operating in a very, very complex environment globally, and AI is really at the center of it. We operate as the world's largest bank. We are also the world's largest purchaser of technologies outside of the public sector. We are one of the world's largest deployers of artificial intelligence and a longtime deployer of AI at that. We have a workforce that is 380,000 people strong across the planet. That includes 30,000 software engineers. We have 110 machine learning PhDs. We have an AI machine learning center of excellence with 2,000 dedicated professionals. So AI, the equities for our firm and as a business and for our operations, they're layered, they are intersectional. But in addition to that, we also have clients of the bank around the world who look to us to provide an assessment and to make sound judgments about the future. And that brings us to the theme here for this session, which is AI futures. And given the complexities that I just outlined, it's kind of remarkable to me that geopolitics at JP Morgan Chase sometimes is still treated as something of an abstraction, whereas in reality, this is really, it's our best evidence. It is the signal as to the operating environment for businesses around the world, but it's also our best evidence of the future of travel for this technology, how it's going to reshape the landscape for businesses, for communities, and for societies. And so in recognition of this importance and kind of centrality of geopolitics to assessing the future, about 3 months ago, our CEO launched a new institute, the Center for Geopolitics. It functions as sort of a firm-wide center of excellence that is providing geopolitical strategic advice that is public-facing. It's really intended to serve our client community and our executive leadership as they are navigating these business environments. But about a week ago, we published a paper. Tara Lyons and I partnered with this new Center for Geopolitics to release a report on the geopolitics of AI. And these are really big topics, and so I'm really essentially just going to have time to kind of preview each of these themes. But what we've done here is really tried to identify 7 defining axes that are really animating the landscape globally. I think that there are 7 axes, but there are really kind of 2 dominant poles across the axes, the US and China. And so I think maybe just starting with China, these obviously represent pretty divergent but very dominant approaches, and China taking a very sort of top-down approach to planning, to deployment. I think a few things that are especially interesting about their strategy is a heavy lean into renewable energies in anticipation of the demands on their energy capacity, subsidized diffusion. It's really fascinating. Provinces are offering vouchers for compute to promote adoption among businesses. And then also what I find interesting, and I don't think is up here on the slides, but a really strong rhetorical pivot from Beijing toward international cooperation and engagement. And I think that this is especially interesting given sort of the US dynamics where we find that the U.S. government has become a little bit more skeptical of international forums and coordinated international efforts. And so that brings us to the U.S. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that the most significant geopolitical development in the past 12 months has been the re-election of Donald Trump. I think what's interesting about it, for one, is that the actual policy positionings for this administration, they so far are not wildly different from the previous administration, particularly when you think about sort of energy infrastructure and the prioritization around national security. But what is different is the orientation of the U.S. government to the technology industry and to the international community more broadly. And I think that just means that all of these priorities have taken on a slightly different flavor. And there are some very interesting kind of variables that cut across each of the dominant themes. A trend that I think is particularly concerning for businesses who operate globally is, in Europe, watching the sort of intensified aspirations toward tech sovereignty. You worry about the impacts as a business for interoperability, for regulatory harmonization. And I would say that sovereignty has been a theme in the EU for some time. It's not new. But I do think that it's especially interesting right now for a couple of reasons. One is that it's happening at a time where the EU is relatively standing alone in its approach to AI regulation, having kind of accomplished an enactment of the AI Act and, continuing obviously towards implementation. But as a first mover, they've sort of taken a position that sets them apart. It's also, this trend is happening at a time when transatlantic relations are particularly frayed, which just kind of create some new dynamics in support of the politics surrounding tech sovereignty. And so I think that, we're just closely monitoring some of the steps that the bloc is taking to really advance its strategic autonomy here and what that might mean. To the south, in the Middle East, if you've been paying attention to major data center build-outs anywhere in the world over the past 12 months, you might have noticed that sovereign wealth funds are underwriting a substantial portion of these efforts globally. It's pretty fascinating to watch. I think it's most important for some of the opportunities that it has helped to catalyze for strategic partnerships with large tech companies, with governments like the United States. I think that this is also interesting to watch for US-China dynamics. A lot of these governments continue to maintain much closer relationships to Chinese infrastructure, particularly in sort of the telecommunications space. And so it'll be interesting to see sort of what their relationships with Chinese providers, sort of how they evolve in the context of some of these broader partnerships. And then this, talent, populism, the workforce, this is just kind of a set of swirling variables. I think that this is an especially spicy pillar of the geopolitical landscape, in part because I think we've only just begun to glimpse how these forces might converge. Populism is obviously a very powerful political trend in countries in literally every region of the world right now. And it's often fueled by impacts to labor. And what we see on screen is how deeply entwined AI talent and immigration pipelines really are. And we've seen potential for job losses to motivate labor activism in isolated contexts so far. And so if these issues collide more forcefully, it's easy to envision it leading to government actions to actually restrict some of these impacts or mitigate some of these impacts, which could cut in a number of different directions. And then energy, hardware, and componentry, this is where you start to see a lot of overlap in the geopolitical currents, especially when you think back to the US and the China strategies. Energy and mineral resources, semiconductors, industrial materials, these have all become strategic choke points. I think that this is also putting, here in the United States, it's putting some new a new stripe onto sort of export controls, but also tariffs. If your stated priority is to aggressively build out data centers, for example, or expand energy capacity, and you're putting tariffs on steel or copper, how are we reconciling those priorities and those kind of those different strategies, and how do they intersect? And so it's definitely something that we're keen to keep an eye on. And then the future of defense, defense integration, reshaping military capabilities and forces. And again, this is a rapidly unfolding and evolving space. I saw a story in the New York Times yesterday that was visually very fascinating about Russian troops essentially surrendering to a computer vision model. And it's just sort of underscores, how advanced these systems are becoming in their applications in these contexts. And so to conclude, and to kind of bring this back to the forward-looking, I do want to share a little bit of like what we're watching in the near term. The report is out there that we've published. Encourage everybody to read it because, as I said, I've really only been able to give you like the very top line summaries here. And we can go into greater depth in the report as to where these trends might be headed and what's interesting. But I think it's especially important to call out the Global South here. I'm so happy to know that there's greater attention this afternoon on the agenda to the African continent. Also very strongly encouraged by some of the early announcements from the AI Summit in India related to how they're going to be positioning the Global South on the program agenda there, and I think that's going to be really important. And then I mentioned earlier the U.S. policy execution. I do just think it's going to be really interesting to watch. I think the AI Action Plan is a terrific document, a brilliant strategic blueprint, but how it intersects with some of the administration's other priorities remains to be seen, and I think that there's a lot to unfold there. And so I am going to leave it at that. I'm past my time, but I want to pass the mic now to Lilian Corral of New America. No problem.
I don't have slides, so you'll just hear from me. And that was super fascinating. I did see the report last week, so congratulations on that. Encourage everyone to read it. At New America, we actually talk about AI from the global to the local. And so ironically enough, that's kind of what we're going to do today in this set of talks. I'm going to focus really on the local perspective in the future, particularly from a nonprofit setting, and share a little bit about that. So, well, it's an honor to join you today. I'll start just by thanking you for the invitation to talk. I come to this conversation from New America. We are a think tank that works at the intersection of technology, democracy, and equity. And across our programs, from digital equity to trustworthy AI and civic innovation, we ask a simple but profound question. And we've heard a lot about this today. So I'm glad that I'm in a room with you all thinking about it, which is how does technology help people thrive and not just survive? I've personally been in the civic innovation space for over 20 years, worked in the public sector, in philanthropy, and now at New America. And that question has really guided a lot of the work that I've done. And I was going to start by telling you a story. Earlier this year, I attended a small gathering in New York, and we were hearing from social impact leaders from across sectors, talking about all types of issues, and obviously AI was at the heart of a lot of conversations. And in one session, we heard the story of this physician, scientist. Some of you may have read about him in the New York Times, Dr. David Feigenbaum. He's a man who's built an organization around an AI model that essentially analyzes thousands of existing drugs, searching for connections that no human can actually see. His story has been shared in the New York Times and has been sort of now broadcasted through many audiences. But he told us his personal story, which was that of patients like Joseph Coates, who was dying of a rare blood disorder. And doctors had told this man that nothing was left to be done. But the AI model that his organization, that Dr. Feigenbaum's organization had built, actually was able to identify properties in existing drugs that could treat the disease, even though those drugs had already been designed for other illnesses. And so within weeks, this man was able to recover, and within months, he was able to be in remission. And what was striking to me was that this was not a new billion-dollar discovery, right? It was just intelligent, purpose-driven use of AI, connected to what already existed and to what was already urgently needed. And it wasn't just Joseph's story, and that's not the only story that Dr. Feigenbaum can speak to. There's a lot of ways in which, in this example, in the healthcare space, AI can test new combinations of drugs, track outcomes for other chronic and incurable conditions, and often with remarkable results. And the story stayed with me partly because this doctor was actually raising money for this work, and I was shocked that he didn't have the resources to be able to do that. But it also stuck with me because having worked in the nonprofit sector and in the tech for good sector, often what we're really working on are information asymmetry problems, right? And AI is exactly and uniquely positioned to help us think about it in this way, revealing what is already known but hidden in plain sight. So it's an invitation for us, I think, in the nonprofit sector, and especially those of us who work locally in communities with residents, to really think about public problems in a different way, one that connects insights across systems, communities, and time. For decades, the nonprofit sector has been the first responder to human need, often stepping in when markets or governments fall short. And in myself, I've seen this up close. One of the opportunities I had in my career was to really build out what we call the 211 system here in California, which is a nonprofit system. It's very unknown. It, again, flies under the radar, but a vital network that actually answers calls and texts from people seeking help with basic needs. In 2024 alone, this system responded to more than 18 million requests for assistance. Everything from where's my local food bank, to can I get a motel voucher because I don't have a place to sleep tonight, to mental health and medical services, and very often from repeat users. Just in 1 year alone, 18 million pieces of data on location, on individual, on need, on where those folks are going to access or to try and access a service. So my thought as I was listening to Dr. Feigenbaum is, what if we could move beyond responding to systems and start, to symptoms, and start actually addressing the systems that are often failing? AI actually gives us a possibility to do that, I believe, if we choose to use it differently. I want to be clear, AI is not a solve for poverty, right? It can't replace the political will, the investment, or the human relationships required to create economic opportunity, to some of the examples I'm providing. But what it can do is it can help us see and address the patterns, the invisible connections across housing, job, health, and education that often keep people trapped in cycles of disadvantage. And used well in the nonprofit sector, it can expand in some ways our field of vision, as I would describe it. So it's not just about us using AI to help a hungry family find the nearest food bank, but it's also about using it after we've helped that family get food to understand the pattern that has kept that family insecure, connecting them not just to a job, but to financial tools and supports that make that hunger less likely to happen again. And similarly, it's not just about public housing and getting someone to housing quickly. It's really about also thinking about the predictive tools and ways in which we can see housing demand, the shifts that are happening across our cities, and help cities plan, zone, and build differently so that supply can actually meet future demand. So that's the kind of problem solving that our sector can lead on, not just faster transactions, but what we call deeper transformations. So what could the future look like? In one version, if you will, the future of nonprofits become sort of AI stewards, I would say, using the data responsibly, designing for equity, holding both the public and the private sector accountable. In another, nonprofits can become AI innovators, building or co-developing these models that reflect the lived experience of the community they serve. And in another version yet, they become sort of AI translators, right? Helping communities make sense of the technologies, ensuring that people have agency and voice in how AI is used. But of course, those are not separate realities. And the most transformative organizations are actually going to be all three at some point in time: stewards, innovators, and translators, sometimes actually in the same week. They'll use that data with integrity, they'll experiment with creativity, and they'll stay rooted in the lived experience of the people that they serve. because that's really what the future demands of us. Nonprofits who can boldly imagine the future for their services and act responsibly. It's a future where local organizations can model long-term impact of policy change before it happens. It's where food banks and workforce development programs can share real-time data and break cycles of poverty. And nonprofits can actually use generative AI tools to design civic engagement, policy simulations, funding strategies that are more inclusive, that are more evidence-based. These are actually not scientific scenarios, and for some of you, you may be wondering why we're not doing it already. I've been working for 20 plus years trying to get data out of the nonprofit sector, and the answers are surprising and shocking. But they are the next horizon of public problem solving, especially in a country where we are seeing the recession of the federal government, the receding, of the federal government's role in service delivery. And they're critical to global politics, right? While I am describing situations in an American context, a lot of the creativity and imagination can also be seen in the foreign one as well. At New America recently, we launched an effort called Rethink AI that precisely seeks to explore this horizon. So we support trusts, pilots, and research that help build civic capacity to use AI well. Trust because the public's confidence on how AI is governed will shape whether it can be used for good. Pilots because the best ideas come from practice, from testing, failing, and learning in real communities. So we worked in Boston around public safety in the neighborhood most plagued by crime in Boston. We worked in New York City on community development to digitize microgrant data from over 10 years from New York City's Citizens Committee. In San Jose, we worked with a housing nonprofit to start to co-design solutions for addressing homelessness. And research because nonprofits and public institutions need a shared evidence base to know what's working and what isn't. So the work that we're trying to do is really about connecting the people doing the work so that civic innovation doesn't stay, or civic AI doesn't really remain isolated in experiments, but becomes more of a movement for equitable innovation. We're standing at an inflection point where the tools before us are powerful, but they don't come in with built-in values, right? So that's our role. That's where we need to actually step in and lean into the design, the conversation, and the creating of those shared values. So as we engage in the discussion today, which I know Kip and I will sit and take questions on, I invite you to imagine a future where nonprofits use AI to not automate empathy, but really amplify the impact. Where AI doesn't replace the human judgment, it equips us with new tools to think differently, to experiment boldly, and to tackle the kinds of problems we've long accepted as unsolvable. And kind of like Dr. Feigenbaum, we use these tools to see what's hidden in plain sight, an act that is actually of creativity and courage unto itself. And where the future of nonprofits really isn't just about survival, but about shaping the systems that shape society. If we can do that, then we can learn to use AI with courage, with creativity and care, and that perhaps I would argue is the technology revolution we've all been waiting for. So, thank you. Step over here?
All right, we'll take audience questions for both Kip and Lilian.
Thank you. So my name's Sarah Hatcher. I'm with Kripke AI. I'm Canadian, but now I'm based in San Francisco. And when I heard you speaking about the ways that we can use data in the nonprofit sector, something that came from my time in UTL, so Toronto Libraries, is something about Indigenous data sovereignty.
Yes.
And so how do you balance situations where having data available is something that's critically important to resolving societal issues, but maintaining the ownership of that data within communities is critically important to honoring our commitments or obligations and what's right for them? And is there any pilot projects that you're doing that is approaching that either in Canada or other similar situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm surprised it was the first one, but I figured it would come up. You know, what's interesting on the data sovereignty piece, it was actually in our Boston pilot where that was the first. It actually came up very naturally, and it was very organic from the community itself. And so the thing that I would flag for all of us to think about is that while we think about a concept like data sovereignty as being quite complicated, it's actually very simple and very clear for the public. They want to know. So the reason why it came up is, I'll explain. In Boston, we were working in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. We were exploring this issue that Boston is technically the safest city in America. But in Dorchester, it's actually where crime persists. And for those of us who have worked in community, we understand that while cities and mayors, and I worked for one in my time, we would boast our crime rate as being the lowest ever. For some of us in some communities, the crime actually is very persistent. So we don't feel safe. And in Boston, the Dorchester neighborhood just doesn't feel safe. So we worked with a neighborhood group to talk about public safety. And part of the challenge is that it's hard to raise concerns around public safety when the institutions don't really don't see a safety problem. All that to say that we ended up being able to access 10 years worth of community engagement data that this neighborhood group had access to. And the first thing they went to is, we want to be able to own the data. We'll let you digitize it after we went through a period of trust and really creating what we call more like a narrow model of a lot of the data that they were producing, commingled with a bunch of institutional and private data, private sector data. But they knew very well that they wanted to own that data, and they knew that their data was valuable. And so the big insight I would say there is, I think we need to just be ready to engage in the conversation, to not think that data sovereignty is actually quite a complicated concept, but actually be ready to really negotiate, if you will, the terms and be able to do the work. So in the nonprofit sector, that's going to look a lot different than for those of you that work with proprietary models, et cetera. But for us, it was very clear that this is their data, and in order to work with them, in order to be able to be creative and try and tackle this problem, we had to be able to honor the fact that that they had to own their data in a way. And so we created a set of agreements, and we built around that concept. So lean in, engage, and you'll actually find community individuals who are really ready to have the discussion.
Sure. David Danks, UC San Diego. I guess I would need to ask, because it felt like there was a real tension between the two futures that you were each pointing to. On the one hand, Kip's future seemed to be driving towards closing things down, closing the technology, keeping it in a country, closing the data. Whereas Lilian, you were much more on the, but as things open, there's opportunities. And so, whether it's for the use of data to improve people's lives, but also to, speak truth to power, which is another thing civil society has long done, is to hold industry accountable when they act in problematic ways. So I was just sort of wanted to invite the two of you maybe to explore a possible tension there between the geopolitics, the global pulling things into a more closed world, and the local being a pressure towards a more open world, perhaps.
I think it's a very astute observation. I want to be clear. The paper and the report on the geopolitics of AI. This is it's not a position paper, right? These are observations. It's analysis, and I do think that our as a business, I would say that our greatest concern is this fragmentation that we're seeing and what it means for a more closed technology environments. I would say, as a person, that is also a great concern of mine. I still cling very dearly to these very quaint notions of the old free and open internet principles, and I worry what it means for digital rights and access to information if your technology ecosystem is determined by sort of the environment that you live in and that you're born into or that you work in. And I think that that's something that PAI and I think corporate leaders, and this is something we call out in the report, is that businesses who are consuming this report, almost all of the clients are large companies. It's that businesses have a very decisive role to play in really driving outcomes here. And if they want a harmonized sort of regulatory environment, that's going to require a more interoperable, a more open, more collaborative and configurable technical environment. And we need to, it is incumbent on businesses to make that clear and to express themselves and to advocate in that direction. I think that The multi-stakeholder community, though, is really poised right now to, I think, articulate this in a way that really draws on all of the profound sort of implications of this more kind of closed future that we do, I think, geopolitically seem to be kind of inching toward. And so I think that having a forum like this one where kind of both sides of this coin and this stakeholder set are at the same table and having the same conversation is really important in sort of identifying kind of a path, an advocacy framework, and kind of a path towards really pushing us in a productive direction.
Yeah, I love that you pulled out that tension, and I actually think it's a tension we all need to hold together for all the things that you said. I think, and at New America, we advocate for very open, interoperable policy. We've put a couple of pieces out over the last year on open source models and the importance of maintaining an open ecosystem. And I would say, I think that the big reason why we need to, or perhaps the thing that we all need to grapple with, is the opportunity cost. I think that what I'm describing for you is the opportunity cost of being just wholly driven by a closed system and model and view of the world. And I think that that is a problem that could be, well, I would argue that it could be a potential problem for all of us, even for industry, because these challenges, these complex public policy challenges that I'm describing to you, impact all of us, right? Food insecurity, climate change, public safety, housing, those are issues that are going to impact workforce, that impact everybody's bottom line at the end of the day. And so I do think that there is a shared opportunity here to address these issues with the technology. I think it's incumbent upon us to understand that we need probably a little bit more openness than the way in which we're driving, and that if we don't get that, then it's gonna, at some point, it probably does have some impact on the bottom line of industry itself. So these things are not exclusive. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's the tension that you're highlighting.